there's a sort of a magic kind of clarity that comes with turning 50, I think. You begin to kind of prioritize meaning over momentum and purpose over power.
I had thousands of people working for me. When they look at me, they see someone they want to aspire to be. It really came down to that question for me. Do I want to keep doing this? And how can I challenge myself differently? You do get comfortable, but you also get afraid you've achieved so much, but you get afraid to fail.
Let's zoom through. Welcome to The Experience Exchange, the podcast for people who've spent decades building careers and are now asking, what's next? I'm Pippa Woodhead. In this series, we're having honest conversations about second acts, what it takes to reinvent yourself, how to rebuild credibility without the title, and why your experience still matters even when everything feels different. Let's get started. There's often an assumption that once you hit your 50s, you've missed the window, that starting something new is for younger people with more energy, more runway, more time. But as you'll hear today, that is completely wrong. Today on The Experience Exchange, we're asking, what does it actually take to reinvent yourself at 50 and beyond? I'm joined by Sachin Shah, who left his GM role at Manulife and co-founded Pentara Capital, and Farzana Aslam, a lawyer turned legal headhunter, DE&I leader, and coach who works with professionals through times of change. Sachin, my first question for you. You spent years at Manulife before you co-founded Pentara Capital. What made you decide that this is what you wanted to do next?
Pippa, it's great to be here, and Farzana as well with you. And I really appreciate this opportunity. And hopefully what I have to share will be of value to people. I think I got to a point with my career, having spent almost 35 years in financial services with all multinational corporations, and really having the privilege of having worked all over the world, New York, Tokyo, Singapore, and I call it done it all. I got to the point where I was like, well, what's next? What do I do? And being a CEO within a large corporate, the jobs above you become fewer and fewer. And the criteria that is required to get those jobs isn't always about who had the best results or the best performer. There's a lot of soft criteria that goes into the decisions and timing. And having been on boards and chaired boards, I really appreciated that the next big move was going to take a lot longer or never happen. And for me, it brought to really the front for me a question of, do I want to keep doing this? It's a great paycheck. It's a great job. And my father always said, don't leave a good paycheck and a good job. But it really came down to that question for me. Do I want to keep doing this? And how can I challenge myself differently? And I'd always wanted to be an entrepreneur, was always afraid to be an entrepreneur. And it took, I'll be honest, about 2 years of really thinking this through and saying, I'm going to step off this train. And it was a really, really hard decision for me to walk away from all the surroundings that I had had around me for a long time and had proudly, in many ways, worked hard for, built, and my family had sacrificed with me along the way for me to be able to achieve the things that I achieved. It was a tough call, but it ultimately came down to just, how do I get up every morning, be motivated, and feel really good about what I'm doing? And how do I ensure that every day when I had thousands of people working for me, when they look at me, they see someone they want to aspire to be. And they see someone who's fired up, getting up every morning, 4 or 5 a.m., whatever it is that turns you on in the morning, and getting out there and setting a standard for him or herself. And it was those types of questions that were bubbling around, swirling around in my head. Am I really in it? Or am I here because it's comfortable? And am I here because I'm afraid to take the risk to do something different, even though I feel like I want to do something different? And just, I'll call it bridging that gap or crossing that bridge was really the big decision point for me. And it's the best thing I've ever done. I feel 20 years younger, honestly. I feel like I'm really ready to attack the world every morning. I'm working probably the same or more hours as I was before in a global corporate CEO role. You're working all the time. I'm working the same, to be honest, but I don't have any regrets. I don't stress over meetings. I feel really good because every meeting I feel is purposeful to what I'm doing, what I'm building. And I've been really fortunate to have people who have decided to follow me. And that really invigorates me as well. like, wow, people are willing to, they were working with me in this comfortable corporate setting. They see me do this and they're willing to leave that behind and come work with me again. You do get comfortable, but you also get afraid you've achieved so much that you get afraid to fail. And then you get caught in that box, so to speak. And it takes real mental energy to work through the gymnastics in your head. It was all about me in the end. There was no one else, nothing else in the way of doing this 5 years ago or 2 years ago. It was all me. And then it's been a great learning journey, to be honest.
I'm so glad you feel 20 years younger.
I know. I used to do that.
Maybe going to the gym more helps too.
Yeah. So Farzana, so Sachin chose entrepreneurship over staying in corporate and pivoting in that way. From your recruitment perspective, what are you seeing when someone at the stage is looking to pivot or transition? What sort of things are they saying to you?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting and fascinating to hear your perspective and reflections, actually, because it does echo a lot of the themes that come through conversations that I've had with people who are in their 50s. I mean, I predominantly focus on the legal profession, but within that kind of work with financial services professionals. And what I sort of tend to see, first of all, is that people absolutely like yourself who get more reflective as they get older. So actually their focus changes. They get a bit more clarity, whether it's through life events or just reaching a certain age. There's a sort of a magic kind of clarity that comes with turning 50, I think, where you sort of reevaluate, there's probably more road behind you than there is in front.
That's right.
So you begin to kind of prioritize meaning over momentum and purpose over power. I mean, those are the two kind of big things that people really start to sort of search for when they get to a certain stage. And that kind of comes through in their career decisions. Now, the trouble with a profession like the law is that people kind of get boxed into the legal profession. So the idea of pivoting to something outside of the law or even outside of the law firm environment, whether it be into private practice or into kind of the corporate world more generally, is attached to fear. There's no question about that. I think, moving away from even calling yourself a lawyer to a non-lawyer, I've been through that transition myself, and it is a bit like, oh, am I ready to say I'm not a lawyer anymore? There's a little bit of, there's a lot of status and kudos that goes with being a lawyer that you have to sort of be prepared to leave behind and take a leap of faith if you want to go into something completely new. I know people who have done it and not one of them has regretted it. What I do see in my world, though, also is people who I think perhaps hang on for too long for the wrong reasons, driven more out of fear than out of wanting to kind of do something different with their life. And that, I think, can become challenging because sometimes the decision to pivot isn't left to them.
Yeah, the whole meaning thing, I think, I've heard this from a lot of friends as well. They get to their 50s and it's like,
no question.
Is this my life?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's kind of triggered by quite sort of major life events like the loss of a loved one, a close member of your family or a spouse or a divorce. I mean, these are big, big life changes that can really trigger some sort of thinking that whilst you're kind of focused on momentum and success, you're not necessarily sort of seeing or thinking about the bigger picture of what do you really want in life, and are you at where you thought you'd be at this age? But those are the questions that begin to creep up as you get into your 50s.
When you're over 50 and you're starting a company, what advantages do you think you have versus someone younger and starting a company?
The advantage is we've been there, done it. We've built businesses. We've seen things fail. We've seen things grow. The second is you also know the decisions that you don't waste time on and the ones you spend more time on, right? We all cut our teeth through life on those, but you get to a point where, particularly from a business setting, you know the things that don't really matter and you don't worry about them or you let others worry about them. And there are the few things that you need to put your energy into, and you've already had that maturity and experience there. The third, and I think this has been the most powerful, and I tell you, the most humbling thing for me is your network. The people you've come across and how you did something unknowingly in a positive way, and someone remembers that. And when you now call on them to go get an insight or ask for a referral or whatever it might be that you're asking for. And they start out by, hey, I remember when we were together in this and you said this and wow, that moved me. And you're like, geez, I didn't even know. I don't remember saying that. And I don't even know that I had that kind of impact on you, let alone anybody else. And so it's really humbling to see how people do remember your impact and that you had on them, whether you were a leader or a coworker or whatever it might have been in terms of the situation, and how that memory then allows that door to open again and opens other doors because now you're coming at them in a very different way. There hasn't been anybody that I haven't been able to talk to or get in front of since I launched this whole idea and the business. And every time it happens, I'm just like, wow, I'm so fortunate.
Mm. So there's been this theme running through this series. I think I mentioned this to you earlier, that this question of when does experience still matter? You said something then that made me think, right, this is the time to ask. Because people can get a bit insecure thinking a lot of my knowledge is now in an AI. What are your thoughts on where...
Sorry, I haven't even let you finish that question because I actually think this is one of the areas where, that the whole threat of AI, and I think it's a real threat that we're only really beginning to kind of grapple with in terms of the implications. But for older people, we're in sort of a sweet spot because we do have experience and leadership capability and emotional intelligence that actually you don't have when you're younger. So at this point in time, AI is absolutely going to be able to replace, young lawyers, for example, on due diligence exercises, on drafting exercises. I mean, but they're still going to need somebody to carry out the face-to-face negotiations, to be front-facing with the clients, to deal with the difficult kind of, intractable issues that come up in a deal, right? And for that, experience, I think, is absolutely invaluable. So I think older workers at this particular point in time actually can sort of feel relatively good about the fact that they are still needed and not easily replaceable by AI.
I completely agree. I think the first 5 years of any white collar job is getting wiped out.
Yeah.
And I really worry about, I have children that are in that age bracket and some that are coming into that age bracket. And I really worry about how will they learn?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because to your point, when AI spits something out, you still need to look at it and validate that it makes sense, it's appropriate, it's not hallucinating. How do you do that if you haven't had that experience prior to that? So I do think inherently for us, there is an advantage today, as Farzana said, but I do think it's a big concern.
Farzana, when someone is over 50 and they're looking for a new role or they're looking to pivot or transition, what are the most common mistakes you see?
Okay, so I'm going to say this out loud and wait for the backlash. But one of the things that I think is a fatal mistake is putting open to work on LinkedIn. I just, I see it as a recruiter and I think, no, please don't do that. Don't do it. Because there's just a simple rule and it's all kind of fundamental basic human psychology. But when you are in a role, when you're already in a job, it's that much easier to find a new job.
Yeah.
So the first thing I would say is if you are frustrated with your current role and desperately want to do something else, plan it. Don't make an emotional decision because you're really, your boss said something that finally kind of really annoyed you and you want to walk out the door. Really think about having a proper exit strategy and possibly getting someone to help you think that through. So kind of going straight out into the job market and say, hey, I'm open for hire. Doesn't always work. Much more attractive is the person who's already wanted and in a role, and then people will end up saying, oh, let's take a look.
So before you're unhappy enough to quit.
Absolutely. Do your thinking. Don't wait. And I've seen this so many times. People make a decision to leave at the point of overwhelm.
Yes.
At the point where they have become, and when I say, I use emotional as if it's a bad thing. It's not bad to be emotional, but don't let that affect when you leave, right? Whether you leave, absolutely, that should be guided by your emotion as much as logic or finances or anything else. But, how you leave and and when you leave really should be kind of planned, right?
Yeah.
And have a bit of a strategy around that. And I'm amazed how many people don't have a plan. So even people who know, so for example, some of the law firms, some of the consulting firms, many of them actually have a cutoff age. They have an age at which partners are expected to leave. Right. Now, the fact that that's illegal in some countries, if not most countries, it's neither here nor there. There's an expectation that they will leave. But I've had conversations where I've asked really good friends of mine, so what's your strategy then? Oh, I don't know, I haven't really thought about that. That's not till next year. And I'm thinking, oh my God, are you serious?
What's the age when?
Well, for some firms it's 60. For some firms it's 55.
Yes.
Really?
Absolutely.
Where they expect you to voluntarily leave. If not, they will push. Wow, okay.
Yes. Yeah. Which is, scarily young, right? Scarily young. And I think, look, in different jurisdictions as well, I think age is valued more than others. So, and I think there are good reasons for that. I want to say good, but there are explanations for that. But in, for example, the States, right? If you can be in a law firm till your 60s, 70s even.
Oh, really?
Absolutely.
Oh.
Because people expect to see the grey hair in a room when they have their lawyers march in. They want to see the elder statespeople. They want to see the people with the experience, with the knowledge, with a body of experience behind them. That's not the same in other jurisdictions. It really isn't. But part of that is normative and cultural, because in the US, they've had age discrimination legislation dating back to the 60s, right? In the UK and in other jurisdictions, we're talking about 30 odd years later, if not longer, 50 years in some jurisdictions. And in some jurisdictions, like Hong Kong, for example, there is no age discrimination that's mandated. So, of course, what becomes acceptable in the workplace is often dictated by what they have to do rather than what they necessarily think is the right thing to do.
Yeah. And if we talk about ageism, so I have a friend who's a headhunter like you and said to me recently that she had a client who came to her said, we want someone with grey hair.
Right. Yes, I have that. I do get that as well. But let me tell you when that arises. It's generally because there's nobody in the room with grey hair, and that the people below. So let's say a senior partner has exited the firm, right? And then if there's nobody below that partner other than people in their 30s, then there can be a bit of a credibility gap with certain clients. So what they'll do is they'll replace that one senior leader. What they're not going to do is if there are people in their 40s and 50s below that senior person, they're not necessarily going to hire a replacement. They'll kind of, rightly so, have a succession plan. What they won't be doing is hiring 5 people in their 50s. They'll be hiring one person, and let's say they're a role for 5 people, they'll be hiring one person in their 50s, and the rest will be what they call people with a longer runway.
Okay,
and
that's the diplomatic way to say
that is the terminology that's used. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about the advantages of starting a business over 50, and you said you've got so much energy, which is fantastic. Many people will think, oh, I've missed the boat to start a company. This is what we hear a lot. What do you think?
I think the biggest advantage of waiting, if that's the right way to say it, is hopefully you're more financially secure.
And
so
you can take the risk.
Exactly, because there's a lot of ways to pivot your career. And as Farzana said, you shouldn't do it until you have another job. Stay, as I said, my father always said, stay in a good job with a good paycheck until you have another one. But for me, it was a meaningful pivot where I knew I couldn't do it from where I was. And I would need to step off that train and then re-engage in the way that I wanted to, because I was coming back into the insurance industry, but through a private equity lens. So I had to separate, so to speak, from where I was. But I think part of it is financial security and really being able to feel like, okay, I can do this, I can take this risk, and come at it with a sense of, if I do this for 18 months or 24 months and it fails, I'm not going to be like broke out with hat in hand for my retirement. And that, I think that is one of the advantages of waiting till a little bit later. And everybody has a different threshold of what that might look like for them. And again, for me, it took a lot to get my head around that, because being a first generation immigrant, My father moved to the US with $17 in his pocket. And so you really don't walk away. You never think there's enough money.
Mm.
It's just, that's your mindset. And so you get to a point where, every dollar is another dollar and I need another dollar.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of good in that. I think it drives you in certain ways. You make certain decisions, but it can also keep you trapped in places. And being able to recognize that there's a line here, I've passed it, and I'm now very comfortable, and I can go take some risks because of that. So I think that's probably the biggest advantage in my mind of waiting, is just that. It is the financial element, I think, quite candidly, that prevents people from taking that risk sooner.
Mm.
When you have success in a corporate situation or setting, it's a very comfortable life.
Yes.
In many ways. Now, I think to Farzana's point, and corporations also don't have any loyalties at all. I worked at a company for 20 years, and the last 18 months, 2 years was really difficult. I didn't need to leave, but I decided to leave to take a bigger role in another company. But it was amazing to see how 20 years, yes, lots of relationships, lots of experiences and memories. But for the company, it was no loyalty at all. And since then, through other experiences, you find out that quick. And when you're a CEO, you are faced with those decisions too. Mm. And you understand how the company thinks. And so when you're on the other side of that conversation, then you very quickly know what the calculus is on the company side. Yeah. And so also beginning to embrace that idea that there's no loyalties here. And so if there's going to be any loyalty, it should be you to yourself, first and foremost, because no one else really cares, no matter what they say.
The assumptions behind ageism are often that people are less hungry, less ambitious, less wanting to do things. I mean, you're very much proving that wrong.
Probably, but I think it's definitely a generalization. I mean, I lived and worked in Japan for 9 years, right? And to the points that Farzana was making earlier, talk about a society where people are working until they're 75, 80, whether you're a restaurateur or a CEO, it doesn't matter in Japan, right? It's almost a necessity given the demographics there. But here you have people who they outwardly look clearly like they're a bit older, but they're going at it every day. Mm. They show up, and whether it's the sushi chef who's 75 or 80 and has built this business, and you see his son who's still he's probably 50 years old but not taking over the business, or it's a CEO of a major Japanese global corporation. They all have the energy, they have the contribution, and part of it comes down to who's around you, right? Because the value of being there is that you have tremendous experience. And so the question is, who's that team around you? And how do you build that team so that that experience actually becomes monetized, if that's the right way to say it?
And Farzana, just as ageism is something that keeps coming up in this series, as you're a DEI professional, what are your thoughts on this? Ageism isn't something that normally comes up in DEI conversations.
It isn't, partly because, as I've sort of said, it's probably one of the things that, the statute books have thought about right at the end, 50 years after sex and race and other protected characteristics. So I think it's almost become an acceptable workplace discrimination that goes on. It's almost blatant, actually. So I do think people need to be educated around that. I mean, also, I do think that, to your point, the experience that walks out of the door when somebody, particularly someone who's been at an organization for any length of time, the know-how, the relationships, the goodwill, and a lot of companies sort of don't really capitalize on that knowledge. So even, for example, where law firms are exiting or, saying goodbye to a partner who gets to a certain age, often that's it. Off they go, nice leaving party, maybe an annual alumni event, but that's it. Now, to my mind, there is I would say from a DEI professional perspective that there's almost an obligation on firms to look after people not only on the way in and when they're there, but kind of on the way out as well, right? Particularly where a person, and I'm going to get onto gender dynamics in a minute around this, but where a professional truly identifies themselves with that role of being a lawyer, for example, a partner in a firm. Sometimes these partners last for, they've been partners for 20, 30 years in the same firm. They started as a trainee, they're leaving as a senior partner in the firm, and then that's it. All of a sudden, they're not a partner anymore. And I think a lot of partners really struggle with that. Now, on the gender side of it, I think women manage better because women tend to, huge generalization, but a lot of women end up having career breaks through, having children. And so they're sort of almost forced to take those breaks where they are no longer identifying themselves as a lawyer, but the mother of, or so they're sort of, they've had to juggle different identities, and they tend to do it a lot better than men do, who sometimes focus solely on career and actually don't give too much time or devote too much time to the sort of the caretaking parental side of their life. So it's a real struggle when they leave. So I guess that's sort of a long, there are lots of angles to this ageism piece, but I think one is, actually overt discrimination around not hiring people because they're over a certain age, or else expecting them to leave once they get to a certain age. But also, are firms really doing enough to look after the well-being of people who are going to be kind of off-ramping at a certain age? And my own experience is I don't think they are. I don't think they're doing a good job of that.
So what would you like to see happen?
I think, offering outplacement services or career coaching, transition coaching, that kind of thing. I know that some of the consulting firms, for example, I'm thinking of one that actually starts to talk to its sort of partners a year or so in advance of them leaving to start giving them suggestions and putting them in contact with people and, really sort of encouraging them to think, right, there has to be life after this, recognizing that it's actually not going to be a great thing for that person to go into the void and think they're going to be happy on the golf course every day, because invariably they will not, unless they are a very good golfer and they've got lots of mates who are also doing the same thing. But generally it can be a very, very lonely and dispiriting experience if you haven't kind of planned and thought about what you're going to do with your time.
Yeah. Suddenly the phone stops ringing. And
you're no longer a partner. And actually, talking of the way that women and men deal with this, so there's one particular partner of a Magic Circle firm who decided at a certain point in her career, she was in her 50s, that she was going to stop being a partner at this firm. She was a very successful partner, and devote her time to philanthropy. And her fellow partners at the firm, at one point, she met them and she gave them a card, as you do in Asia, a business card, and it just had her name on. And they were like, where's your title? Where's your title? And she was like, well, I'm doing what I'm doing now. And they said, but surely you should just put that you're an ex-partner of the firm. And she said, why? I don't have to define myself in that way anymore. But to the male partners in particular, it was like, oh my goodness, couldn't imagine not defining themselves by reference to being a partner or even an ex-partner of a firm, which I think, is... I think that's a little bit sad, actually. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean, that kind of shows you how much investment one can make in a firm. And at the end of the day, to your point, Sachin, everyone's indispensable.
You feel like
everyone's dispensable. Nobody's indispensable.
You feel like you give so much of your life and your time and your care to a company that doesn't care about you back. It's quite a harsh reality when it hits you.
Yeah, it's a bit like, I always sort of say to my daughter in particular, she had her first boyfriend recently, and I said, whatever you do, don't forget your friends. Don't forget the life around you. If you invest yourself solely in one relationship, it's the same with an employment relationship. If you invest yourself solely in that relationship and not really pay attention to other aspects of your life that you nurture, whether it's outside interests or hobbies or people that are beyond your profession, when you leave, when there's a breakup of that relationship, it's pretty devastating.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yes. But can we talk more about transitions and that sort of emotional piece. And I'm wondering, you as a coach and someone who advises people all the time, if people come to you and say, actually, I'm not just wanting to pivot, I'm thinking of doing something completely different. Like, how do you talk them through that?
Well, I think that's really exciting when somebody does that, actually, because normally people like to stay slightly within their comfort zone around what they do. And actually, there's usually very good reason for that. Why not leverage the kind of the know-how that you have, right? But, I would work through things like, okay, first of all, can you do it? Can you afford to do it financially? Do you have the support of people around you to do it? Because if you're in a relationship and your wife or your husband is saying, over my dead body, that is not, I'm going to leave you if you do such a thing, then you've got a bit of work to do before you take that leap, yes. Right? So I think, really kind of getting your ducks in a row, I think is very, very important. But, interrogate your values and have a bit of a self-audit about, is this just a sort of a fantasy, or is it something that actually is going to give you meaning and purpose through this next phase of your life? And do a bit of experimentation. I think people believe that they have to have this like one brilliant idea and that's it. No, try and just experiment a bit before making a big commitment to go into something completely different.
Because I guess you transitioned, but you transitioned, like your company works with people in the insurance space,
That's
right? So it wasn't like you went off and became an
artist,
a physiotherapist or something like that.
I have no artistic skills whatsoever, so thank God.
So you were still sort of connected to the previous industry.
Yeah, and I think it was, as Farzana said, it was maybe one or two steps left or right of center,
yes,
but not a complete jump into something different. And it was really a way to balance, I guess, the desire to do something different, which is to be an entrepreneur and build something, but leverage the 35 years of experience, relationships, and achievements that I've had in a way that I think hopefully ensures greater probability of success, right?
So what's your advice for someone in their 40s or 50s who's thinking about making a change, whether it's starting a business or pivoting? What should they be honest with themselves about? What should they be questioning?
I think I'd say three things. One is take control, right? There really is no one else who's going to make that decision and take control from a career perspective. There's no company who cares about your career, no matter what they tell you. And it's not, again, said in any bitter way, but it is an important reality. I have so many younger people who come to me saying, well, what is the company going to do to help me? What is the company going to do to help me? Or how are they going to train me? And I said, flip it around. What do you need? Are you asking for it? If you're not getting it, are you thinking about ways you're going to get it outside the company? And ultimately, if you need to change the company, you should, because if you need these things and you're not getting it from the company, don't think they're going to somehow wake up one day and say, oh, we should be doing this for you or for him or her. So first is take control. The second is, being confident. And I find this very interesting because, obviously I've had many very successful women and women executives, and they all always, I call it struggle with self-confidence, right? But I find on this topic, and I use myself as an example, but equally many of the male friends I know, men struggle with this point too of how do I leave this, right? Because this is all, in many cases, as you said, Farzana, singularly wired for this. And now you're saying, I need to step out of this box. They really lack the confidence to do it. And so I think the confidence point on this is gender neutral in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I for my doctorate, I actually looked at the structural and attitudinal factors that motivate women to leave private practice law firms. And most of the women I interviewed for that research project went into in-house roles, GC roles, like very, very prominent, powerful GC roles. And there wasn't a lack of confidence there for sure. But one of the interesting observations that came through that piece of research was the number of women who said, there were many of my male counterparts who would have loved to have done the same thing, but they didn't do it because they were the sole breadwinner. And they didn't have either the financial or the sort of the framework at home to be able to just step away.
Yeah.
So, I think confidence can come from, I agree that in some ways, ironically, and I'm sort of loath to almost say it, but women have a bit of an advantage in that regard, because sometimes they are not the sole financial provider, and therefore they are a bit more confident about taking that leap of faith. I think there's sometimes for men, there's a lot more riding on their decision, and it's not just about them. Yeah.
And the third point I'd make, just to build out, is just do it. Really, I think about the machinations I went through and the mental gymnastics that I did over 2 years of thinking about this. It was, I would call it wasted time.
Had a coach.
Exactly. Had I known you. But it is, there's an element of where I feel like, wow, I just stressed and overthought things and scenarioed out too many scenarios. And a lot of it just came down to just do it. Yeah. Because I was clearly at a point where I could do it successfully. Will it change the outcome ultimately here or not? I don't think so. But if to the point of giving advice and sharing with others who are thinking about this, it is equally that just do it. And maybe if you're a little bit younger, it's even better because you can actually you have more runway to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I mean, the confidence issue is quite an interesting one, because I did read something the other day. There's a piece of research that showed that, there's a confidence curve that basically increases as you get to 50 and then decreases when you get to 60. Right?
It's very true.
So you kind of actually, when you hit 50, you have a surge of confidence because you actually no longer care what people think anymore. So you're not afraid to say what you mean.
That's right.
You're not afraid to kind of be values driven. And there's a certain power that comes with that. But I think but as you get older, definitely that decreases, I think. So again, body of research that supports that.
Why does it dip down?
I just think as you get, you see at the age of 60 is a big number, right? I know people coming up to that age. I'm not going to tell you how far away I am from that, but and it sort of looms, right? In the way that when I turned 50, I loved it. I absolutely embraced turning 50. I really did. I remember having, I remember a kind of a speech I gave at my 50th, and I ended it by saying, "There is only love." And, it was like, I just felt so good about life and about turning that age, because you sort of step into who you are and who you've become in a way that you're sort of only discovering that as you go, in my view, anyway. That was me.
So any final thoughts for anyone wanting to reinvent in their 50 plus?
For me, it's about planning. It really is. I mean, I would say to any young professional, start thinking about, setting yourself up for the next stage of your career sooner rather than later. So, build your point about network, I think, is absolutely spot on. I found that in my 50s as well, that I'm in the recruitment world only relatively recently, but what has been invaluable to me is a network that I've built over the last sort of however many decades.
Yeah, or going from lawyer to legal headhunter. That would be very valuable.
Well, I've gone through sort of being at the bar to being in-house at an investment bank to being an academic and, teaching a generation of lawyers to now being in the recruitment world. So I find myself sitting quite pretty in this world because I'm well connected. So network is absolutely invaluable. And I will say diversity of your network as well, right? So if you're in insurance, don't just know insurers. If you're in the law, don't have all your mates only being lawyers, right? Think outside of the box and cultivate and be curious about different people throughout your life. And that will pay dividends. It really will.
Nice. Thank you both so much.
Wonderful. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to The Experience Exchange. I'm Pippa Woodhead. If you're thinking about or starting a second act career, have a look at the other episodes in this series. They've been designed with you in mind. And if you're in Singapore, come visit the Experience Exchange on Ang Siang Road, where these conversations happen in person. See you next time.